This lesson is on feudalism and urbanization, and this is part 2 of a 3-part series on Western Europe in the post-classical period. Now first let's start with feudalism, right? And this is a topic that I've talked about before in our studies of classical China, but I want to review this with the vocabulary that was used in Europe at the time to clarify it within this context. Right? So in feudalism, the king owns all of the land in the kingdom. And he gives land to his top warriors, who are known as his vassals. Now these would be higher nobility, people like dukes and earls. These are top warriors, right? And then they would in turn give the land to their warriors, who would be at the level of knights. And knights lead manors and give military service and taxes to their lords, and their lords are the vassals of the king. And then the vassals provide the kings with knights and then the tax monies that they've collected, right? So you think back to the first lesson in this series, these knights are in charge of these manors. This is part of the extension of that manorial system. So there's that connection there, right? But there's, feudalism is not a perfect system because dukes and knights often shifted their loyalty to the king who could provide them the most land and the best money and things like that. And over time, these dukes and upper nobility, these lords, started to push back against kings' unlimited power. They realized how much power they had and started to push back. And so in places like England and other places in Western Europe, parliaments were formed. And parliaments came together to work out agreements between kings and their vassals. It's kind of an early form of democracy, although the serfs and peasants and low-down people didn't vote. But it started to push towards the point where the vassals had a voting stake in the kingdom. And one of the first examples of this, I mentioned the English a moment ago, was a document called the Magna Carta, which is Latin for Great Charter or Great Agreement. The Magna Carta was signed by English vassals and the king, and this limited the power of the English king. Again, we're moving now towards democracy in Europe and moving towards the idea of a constitution as well. The Magna Carta is kind of an early version of something like the American Constitution. Right? At this time period, there were also beginning to be important agricultural advancements in Europe, and a lot of these spread from the East. Right? That's one of the big themes in this series, is that Europe learned a lot from the older parts of the Eastern Hemisphere and really benefited from those advancements that came from the East, and that put them in a position to breach the Atlantic and make contact with the New World. And so some of these agricultural advancements were the horse collar and stirrups. And this is where learned from the Mongols and other people of Central Asia. Right, horse collar goes right around the horse's neck. We see it right here. Allows the horse to pull a plow, with its shoulders instead of its neck, which obviously the horse wouldn't have liked. Stirrup also, right here gives control, better control over the horse to its rider. Also durum wheat, which was an import from Africa. Alfalfa, usually used to feed cows and horses, which was an import from Persia. And then the Europeans made their own technological innovations as well. They developed a curved iron plow, which could dig deeper in the harder rocky soils of Northern Europe, and developed a 3-field system where every 3rd year a field was left unplanted so that its nutrients and fertility could come back while the other 2 fields in the system were being used to grow food. And so all this, as we know from older lessons, more food equals greater population equals a stronger civilization. Right? And so this also made it easier for peasants and manors to produce enough food. And we know back from our studies of history in period 1 that crop surpluses are one of the requirements for complex civilization. You need those crop surpluses to support scientists and armies and priests and things like that, people who don't create food. And then those surpluses also started to create market economies where people traded with one another. Instead of being in that low trade, isolated manorial system, start to get market economies where this manor will only grow this crop, and then down the road this manor will only grow this crop. Then they trade with each other for what they need. Also, with greater crop surpluses, there was more movement into cities, and this is what we call urbanization, right? The root word of city is urban, the Latin word for city. Once you get people into cities, there's greater STEM advancements, greater literacy, greater economic advancements, and this starts that chain reaction or that feedback loop that we learned about in period 1 of world history, and starts Western Europe onto a cycle of greater, more sophisticated civilization. Right? And some of the things that come out of that urbanization are more specialized manufacturing, especially cloth and clothing, including dyeing and weaving and other things that you do with cloth, metalwork, improved carving and carpentry, because now there are people who don't have to produce food, and so they can go into the cities and begin to develop these crafts. Also, banking starts in Europe at this time period. As Europe connects itself to the World Trade Network, there starts to be more long-distance trade, and so paper money becomes more important, right? One doesn't want to carry, 100 pounds of gold on a trip across the continent. They just want to carry a few ounces worth of paper that they can exchange for gold or goods and services at their destination. Also, Europeans began to invest in bonds, which are basically loans at interest, right? Let's say I wanted to set up a trade expedition from France to Persia to purchase silks and other fancy things. I may ask you, hey, I'll sell you a bond here for $100, and you'll give me $100, and then at the end of my trip, I'll give you back $110 because you've invested and I've drawn a profit. You get a part of that profit. And so these bonds are an important part of the early banking system in Western Europe that allows increased trade, increased development. And like I said, they start to have more complex trade over longer distances, right? Europe connects itself to North Africa, the Mediterranean, and the Silk Roads, and starts to be able to get things from far away, China, India, Persia, and Western Europe enters the world network in the same way the Africans did at this time period. Right? And part of that urbanization and that development of specialized crafts are so-called guilds. And guilds are organizations of people, usually men, who did the same job. For example, you might have a weaver's guild, or a carpenter's guild, or a dyer's guild, the people who dyed fabrics. Or we see some other crests here, right? Tailors, tailor clothing, coopers make barrels, right? Millers mill grain. That's the thing about English last names. Very often English last names are, guild associations. You probably recognize them. You probably have friends who are named things like Miller and Taylor, right? And Dyer, right? And so guilds set prices and controlled apprenticeships. They basically decided who could get into that business and how much they would charge. And part of their concern was to guarantee quality, but also to make sure that there weren't too many people acting as dyers or millers or coopers, because they didn't want their prices to go down because too many people were selling stuff. And so in a way, they were kind of similar to modern labor unions in that they protected workers, and kind of like exam boards in that they made sure workers were qualified to do those jobs. So once this, market economy starts really moving, Europe connects itself to the World Trade Network, there's banking, there's specialized crafts, then Europe starts to develop a merchant class, right? And merchants are people who move goods from market to increase their profits. They don't usually make things, they just transport them. They take the risk of moving wine from Portugal to London and then moving wool from London to Portugal, hoping to make a profit on the difference in prices in the two different markets, okay? The example that I've given you there, I just kind of went through that. But, merchants were very important in Europe. Let me back up for a second. Merchants in Europe were freer than just about anywhere in the world, and so they kind of developed a faster, longer trade network compared to other places where merchants were more under control of the government. And, this really blooms into the ideas of capitalism, which is, the economic model that the American system is based on, right? Capitalism is that belief that in private property, and that individuals can do whatever they want with their capital, which is another way of saying property, like money, land, you know, a house, a car, shoes. Obviously, they didn't have cars back then, but, you know, and so like I said, I mean, these European merchants and businesses were some of the freest in the world in terms of what they could do with their capital and being left alone by the government. And I think that's one of the things that made the European economy grow so quickly and so well, is that when people know that they can make a profit and not have that controlled by the government or taken back by the government, they're much more motivated to work hard and try to make money for themselves. And that early capitalist system was one of the things that contributed to the rise of Europe in the post-classical period. And so that's it. Thanks for watching.